So what do you do if a contract has been terminated, but the parties change their minds? Is a terminated contract completely dead, or can you revive it? Hi, everybody. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors and director of the Real Estate Academy of America. And today's contract tip has to do with how you revive or reinstate a contract that has been terminated. So, just want to go over, this is a Georgia Association of Realtors form, GAR form, that prevents you from having to go contact an attorney to write up an agreement between the buyer and the seller. So let me rewind a little bit and let's talk about it. So once a contract has been terminated, it's terminated, and you cannot revive a terminated contract with an amendment, because you can't amend a contract that's terminated. There are a lot of situations where a buyer and seller choose to terminate a contract, or a buyer chooses to terminate a contract in order to protect their earnest money. So what do I mean? Well, one of the most common examples is, let's say there is an appraisal done of the property and the appraisal comes in lower than the contract sale price. Well, the buyer is coming to the end of their appraisal contingency and the time frames for their rights to terminate the contract and protect their earnest money. In the meantime, both buyer and seller think that the appraisal came in unusually low, and they have submitted a request for an appraisal review. However, the buyer is going to terminate the contract in order to protect their earnest money. But if the appraisal comes back and the review comes back and raises the appraisal price, then the parties still want to go back under contract and proceed with the sale. Generally speaking, you would have to rewrite a whole new contract. Well, the lenders have a cow, and they can't rewrite a whole contract because it throws out all the loan work that has been done to that point, especially if it's a government-insured loan like FHA or VA-insured loan. So in order to revive that contract, typically what we had to do was get an attorney to draw up an agreement between the buyer and the seller, to put verbiage in there to revive that contract. Well, again, you can't just amend a contract that's been terminated. Well, the Georgia Association of Realtors Forms Committee recognized this, and a couple years ago came up with a new form, and I just wanted to take this time to go over that form a little bit. It is GAR F290, Georgia Association of Realtors Form F290, called Agreement to Reinstate Contract. Again, this is not an amendment. It is a separate standalone agreement between a buyer and a seller. And so you go through, you fill out the buyer's name, the seller's name, the property address, you reference the binding agreement date, and it says the above reference agreement was terminated by one or both of the parties referenced above. And the buyer and the seller now desire to reinstate this agreement and have it be in full force and effect. And then there's consideration, and it says buyer and seller mutually agree to reinstate the last fully agreed upon version of the above referenced agreement, such that it shall again be a legally enforceable contract and binding upon the parties as if it had never been terminated. All of the terms and conditions and time periods set forth in the above referenced agreement, including binding agreement date, shall remain in full force and effect, except for any changes thereto set forth below, which shall control over any conflicting or inconsistent provisions set forth. And then there are some fill in the blanks. So that's what I really wanted to talk about today, was what do you put in those fill in the blanks? Because this isn't an amendment to the contract, but let's think about it. If a contract has been terminated, depending upon when the parties choose to reinstate the contract, if there was a termination and release agreement signed, if earnest money has been dispersed, then in these fill in the blanks to reinstate this contract, you need to address earnest money. For example, if earnest money has not been dispersed, upon termination, then you would just reference that earnest money to remain on deposit with the holder. If the earnest money has been dispersed, then you need to either have the buyer resend earnest money to the holder or close referencing that there's zero earnest money in the transaction, which you would need to confirm with the lender. The other main issue that gets addressed in this section on the agreement to reinstate is if there is going to be an extension of the closing date. So if this happens early on, sometimes sometimes a buyer will terminate during due diligence period because they were negotiating with some repair items or some issues with the seller. They hadn't heard back from the seller. In order to protect their earnest money, they terminated prior to the end of due diligence. They got it worked out with the seller, so now they're going to reinstate the contract. So if it's generally speaking early on in the contract, the closing date stays the same. If, however, like an appraisal issue where, let's say we're 21 or more days into the contract and it takes a week to get the appraisal worked out, appraisal redone and worked out, or financing or whatever, if we're close to the closing date and now it gets reinstated very soon to the closing date and you need to extend the closing date, then this would be the place where you would address a new closing date. Now, pay attention. If in this little section and this little section is paragraph 2 of the agreement to reinstate the contract, if you are going to address and extend the closing date, remember you must also address if the parties are going to agree that an additional 8-day unilateral extension, the right for one of the parties to extend the contract unilaterally for 8 days based upon that provision in the purchase and sale agreement, is that still intact in this reinstatement, or are you taking that provision out? So take a look at this form if you are in a situation where you're going to reinstate a contract that has been terminated. And again, once it's reinstated, then you can amend it to change all sorts of other issues and agreements between the buyer and the seller. But the two main things that we typically see on that are addressed by the buyer and the seller on this agreement to reinstate a contract are earnest money and closing date. And if you do extend the closing date, you also need to remember to address the right, is it going to stay in the contract or not, for one of the parties to utilize the 8-day unilateral extension. Please subscribe for more contract tips. And thank you so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education. Bye. If you like that video, check out the one here. If you like the content on this entire channel, please click here to subscribe. I try to take even the most complicated of real estate situations and make them crystal clear. See what I did there? Real estate made crystal clear. Thank you guys so much for watching.